Nope.
Despite starting the night in fear, I awoke the next morning well rested, if a bit stiff and cold. The car seat I'd slept in had become less and less comfortable over the hours, but the idea of moving around to a different position terrified me. Whatever had chased me to the car, and been subsequently chased away by Pinto, hadn't come back, but I didn't want to risk losing my line of sight if I heard something. I sat in the uncomfortable seat until the sun began to warm Monument Valley, its rays creeping down the interior of the car, illuminating me. The area around the car was deserted. The creature was nowhere to be seen, and unfortunately, neither was Pinto. I wondered if he had made it out alive, chasing something like that away. It didn't really make sense that the creature was okay trying to hunt me, but was afraid of this little dog. But it had worked out in my favor. Without much hope, I tried the car again. There was a click as I turned the key, but the electronics did not spring to life. My next step was going to be foot travel down the road to the true tourist area, and hope that someone could help me. It also meant leaving my makeshift castle, and hoping the creature didn't like the daytime too much. The only other means of protection I had was a river knife that I'd been able to take from my life jacket and clip to my backpack. It would have to do. After 30 more minutes had passed, the sun was high enough to begin the trek down the dusty road. I offloaded as much as I could from my pack, hoping I would be light enough to make a run for it if I had to. With a final look from the safety of the vehicle, I pushed the door open. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Rotting meat. The same I had smelled the night before when I'd first seen the monster. It wasn't as strong as it had been, though. The dirt around the car was disturbed, like something had walked around it in the night. But I hadn't heard anything. I took a quick look towards where Pinto had chased the creature, and saw a flap of flesh sitting on a rock. It had a tuft of black fur on it, nothing like Pinto's fur. As I approached, I realized it was the source of the smell that had filled the area, becoming increasingly pungent with each step. I was just glad it wasn't Pinto. I hoped he had gotten at least a few more chunks out of that thing. I whistled once, sharply, and hoped the friendly dog I'd found would come lopping out. But the world around me remained quiet. So I turned to the road and began walking, each step producing a puff of dust as my shoes lifted the dirt free from the ground. I felt like an idiot for how far I'd gone. My very best hope was that someone else would come driving along at some point and be able to pick me up, but that was unlikely. So I trudged and made sure to take thoughtful sips of water as I did so. It wasn't going to get unbearably hot, but the sun was still dangerous, and I wasn't going to be able to stop for shade. I stopped early on when I caught movement to my right, deep in the valley. I waited nervously to figure out what was there before the shape of a large deer clarified. My heartbeat slowed as it moved across the landscape, headed in the same direction as me. I didn't even know deer could live out here. The curious side of me wanted to see exactly what kind of deer it was, but the survival was far more important. I'd have to just ask a guide about it, if I ever got out of the desert. About 4 miles in, as I crested a small rise, I saw a glint on the road ahead, something metallic reflecting the sun. A swell of hope filled my heart as I approached and realized it was another car, still a few miles away. With a chance at salvation so close, I picked up my pace, which was probably a mistake. I thought I was home free, and I started to ignore the world around me. That's why I didn't notice when the deer disappeared. When I finally looked again to the right, towards my distant traveling partner, it was gone. Carefully, I scanned the horizon, but saw no evidence that it was still there. The valley suddenly felt far more lonely. I realized as I walked that the car was further than it had originally seemed. As I slowed down to take a sip of water and relax my pace, I caught movement from the corner of my eye. From out of nowhere, the deer had returned. It stopped as I looked over towards it, seemingly aware of my stare. It was closer than it had been, but the gap between us was still huge. Something sweet blew in from the wind. I could make it out of this. The long walk continued. I finally closed the distance to within a mile of the car. The sun wasn't quite overhead yet, but it was awfully close. With a quick tug, I pulled my wide brim hat lower over my head, trying to keep the light off of my face. The deer had been walking beside me the whole time, which I appreciated. But I was feeling cautious. Every time I looked straight ahead, my peripheral vision made it seem like the deer moved in a jittery, stilted fashion. But any time I turned to check, the deer would stop in its tracks. I also had the impression it was getting closer, but that seemed crazy. I would have seen it happen. Whenever the wind blew from the direction of the deer, a hauntingly familiar, sweet smell would cross me. About 200 yards from the car, my hope soured. 2 doors of the car were open, and the vehicle wasn't parked, so much as it was abandoned. The eerie sense of being followed returned. Something was wrong. I picked up the pace again, ignoring the deer beside me. I didn't really care if my movements scared him. I needed to get to that car quickly. When I finally made it, there was no one else there. The car was completely empty, with no keys to be seen. The car was filled with a familiar smell, but I was having a hard time placing it. The interior lights were still on as I leaned in the passenger side and put my hands onto the black fabric of the seat, where they made a strange, squelching sound. I leaned back out and looked down at my palms, colored a deep crimson. After a moment of panic, I looked more around the side of the car. The only places where the blood seemed to be were in the fabric of the seat and a few small drops on the metal doorframe. It made no sense. I looked closely at the window and found an answer. Smears across the glass. They looked exactly the same as the windows in my dad's car after he'd take our big dumb lab on rides. He'd spend the whole time licking them. Revolted, I leaned away and caught the sweet scent again. The deer was staring at me now, only about 500 yards away. Its weirdly pale head was tilted slightly sideways as it kept an eye on me. As I dragged my eyes away from it, I saw the shoe. It was off the side of the road in a small ditch below scrub brush. With no lack of caution, I made my way towards it. I could see some other blue fabric above the shoe, maybe jeans. The smell of shit and blood grew as I approached. What I found was more horrifying than I'd expected. I kicked the shoe once and felt that it was solidly attached to something. When it didn't move, I reached down and pulled, fearing the worst. As the man's body slid out from the other brush, I nearly vomited. One leg was missing entirely, and the stomach of whoever this had been was torn open. I don't know much about anatomy, but I could tell the organs had been destroyed, and some were missing. I looked up to where his face should be, and finally lost the meager water in my stomach. The mouth was open, locked in a rictus of pain, like all of this had happened while he was still awake. But the flesh was missing. After a moment of gathering myself, I reached towards the pants of the body and felt around the pockets. I began to whistle, trying to clear my head. This was the most disgusting thing I had ever done. The pocket on the intact leg was no dice, so I reached toward the mangled side. For the first time in 2 days, I had a bit of good luck as my fingers crossed around the ring there. I pulled the keys free and stopped whistling. And that's when I noticed it. The sweet smell had been getting more consistent, and I'd been ignoring it as I focused on the body. But now I knew what it was. The sweetness of spoiled meat. I jumped to my feet and looked around. The deer was less than 50 yards from me. I stared at it, curling the keys tightly into my fist, wondering if I could beat the creature to the car. It took a jittery step forward, its legs bending unnaturally. Now that I had a closer look, it seemed like the skin of the deer was too loose, and there was something wrong with its head. It took another shuddering step, and I figured it out. The pale coloring on the front of its head had 3 dark spots in it, 2 small and 1 large. Holes, like a face screaming in pain. My eyes darted towards the body next to me as I stepped backwards to the vehicle. The thing wheezed and shook. I could hear a strange clicking as it moved. Blood from the face had stained the deer fur into a disgusting crimson brown. Each of us moved at the same time. I turned and began to scramble towards the car, and it leapt ahead, unnaturally fast. Right as I made it to the car, something hit my back, and it erupted into fire. The smell of rot was all around me, causing me to panic. It was like it had infected my senses. I pushed myself across the passenger seat and kicked backwards without looking. My foot connected with something disgustingly soft, making a sucking sound as I pulled it free. The creature reeled for a moment, which gave me enough time to situate myself in the driver's seat before jamming the keys into the ignition and turning it over. The car hummed to a start, and I floored it as the creature began to climb in. Now that it was no longer pretending to be a deer, it had stretched to its full height, and its legs were dragging behind the vehicle. It screamed in pain, or fury, and finally let go, tumbling across the dirt. I kept the pedal down. I only had about 8 miles left before I'd hit the real road. But as the adrenaline I was feeling died down, my pain started to grow. My back felt like it had been torn apart. I reached my hand behind me and felt one of the gouges. It was pouring blood into the seat. As my fingers brushed the wound, the pain in my back flared, and my vision went black. When I came to, something was licking my face. I turned my head and looked into the eyes of Pinto, his head framed by the stars. The world around us, smelling like death. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed part 2 of this series. If you did, destroy that like button down below. I don't know about you guys, but this story is getting really intense and starting to freak me out. So again, I'll leave the writer's information down below. If you want to read ahead, you can do so. But once again, I will repeat myself. If you come back and spoil anything, I will ban you from the channel. On the last video, my good friend Joe Mike commented, and he said that he walked Monument Valley alone. So in addition to the writer information, I'm leaving a link down below to his YouTube channel, Hitchhike with Joe Mike, where you can check out his series, The Great American Road Trip, and watch him literally visit Monument Valley alone. So there you go, Joe. You can't say I never did anything for you, bud. Alright guys, until next week where we wrap up this epic series, stay safe out there. I'll be seeing you in the next video.